بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا صلوات. واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the chapter of Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 42, He says, وَلَا تَلْبِسُوا الْحَقَّ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَتَكْتُمُوا الْحَقَّ وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Says, and do not mix up the truth with falsehood, nor hide the truth while you know it. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today our goal is to talk about a very important topic. It's a topic that we all suffer from today. And it's not just us living in the West that suffer from this topic. It's everybody around the world. The idea that everything literally has been flipped upside down. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I mean that our lives have been flipped upside down? Yes, that has occurred. That's very true. But why is it that our lives have been flipped upside down? And am I talking specifically about the issue of the pandemic, or did we have a pandemic even before this coronavirus appeared? And I'm not talking about just the hiding of information, right? We came to find out recently, for example, that in the US there were at least 28,000 cases before the first diagnosis was actually announced. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about hiding the information. That is a part of it. But I'm talking about the idea that everything that at one point in time was right, now is wrong, at least a lot of it. And things that before used to be wrong, now are right. Now, in order to understand why it is that this has occurred and how it is that this occurred, it's important for us to look at it from three perspectives. To look at it from a logical perspective, from an academic perspective, and to look at it from an Islamic perspective, of course. So from the logical perspective, the question is, how can something like this happen? I mean, isn't the truth always the truth? And isn't falsehood always falsehood? Or is there a gray zone? You see, it seems that if we were to go back to our original proof of Allah existing, that everything becomes very clear to us, that it causes us to see everything through that lens, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is all perfect, because He is unlimited, because the creator of something is not limited by His creations, that quite simply the creator of all of limitation must therefore be unlimited. That means then quite simply that I can reach the truth with simple deductive reasoning and rational thinking. And yet, there are more people that don't necessarily realize this truth. Why is that? We know that, logically speaking, as Sheikh al-Muzaffar mentions in his book Al-Mantiq, he says that there are several reasons why epistemologically people are unable to gain the truth or true knowledge. One of the very simple reasons is, even though this knowledge may be innate in them, it might be that they're just inattentive. Just inattentive, that's simple. So I can literally go through my entire life being inattentive to a reality. Now imagine how grave that is for me. Imagine how I can go through life literally unknowing what the truth actually is, just because I didn't even think about it. I didn't even pay attention to it. And what we're talking about here really is obvious knowledge, right? Obvious knowledge has, according to Sheikh al-Muzaffar, in his book of logic, he says obvious knowledge has 5 criteria. The first criterion is that the person has to be attentive. So if you're inattentive, then that means that you're just going to miss the information and it's not going to be obvious to you. So all those times when you talk to someone and you say to them, it's so obvious, and you notice that that person is just not getting it, it's because of one of these 5 reasons. And the first reason, the most common reason, is inattentiveness. Exactly like that student who's in class Of course, none of us have done this before, but the student who's in class who dozes off or daydreams, and the teacher's talking about something or the lecturer is talking about something, and then all of a sudden, that student raises their hand up and they ask a question that was answered only a few minutes prior. And the reason why they did so is because they were inattentive. Or for example, if I ask a question and I had given it to you in the lecture, right? And you aren't able to answer, it might be that you missed that portion of the lecture. Either you weren't there at all, or you were there, but you had just eaten iftar, or it was before iftar and you were really tired. And after iftar, of course, you get really tired also. So what happens is that affects your attention span. So inattentiveness is the first reason. The second reason, he says, is that the person might not be healthy. He might not have healthy senses. Let me give you an example. I remember in college, I took a course called The Psychology of Pain. And the father of modern pain psychology, Dr. P. Melzak, was my professor in that class. And he is the one that actually discovered something called the pain corpuscle, which is basically, subhanallah, a creation of Allah that exists within the skin itself. Without it, what happens is we can't feel pain. So he showed us examples of people who literally put their hands on burners and didn't know that they were burning their hands, meaning they weren't attentive to it, because of the fact that they didn't have the pain corpuscles in their skin. They were born without them. And so what ended up happening is they only knew that their hand was burning when they could smell the burning of their skin. So then having healthy senses is important. How many times, for example, have we been sick, right? Or sleeping, and someone comes to us, wakes us up and asks us a question, and we're just drowsy and we're unaware, right? We might even answer them and answer them wrong. Of course, that's a trick that my kids use with me in order to get what they want. Okay, so then we have inattentiveness. We also have the second, logically speaking, the second reason for not paying attention to or not knowing information that is obvious, such as being attentive to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and that is the truth. Other than inattentiveness, the second is not to have healthy senses for whatever reason, or impaired senses. The third thing he says that is a criterion, other than being attentive and having healthy senses, he says it has to be that it's something that doesn't require a lot of thinking, right? So it doesn't require me to think too hard. Notice how quickly we were able to come to the conclusion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only exists, but that he's unlimited. And yet when we talk to certain people, they tell us, oh, this is a complex matter. It requires a lot of research. We need to sit down. We need to look at the cosmos. We need to do this, that, and the other, right? But we were able to do it in seconds. So it should be that obvious knowledge then has to be something that doesn't require a lot of work, doesn't require a lot of thinking. The next thing that he says is it's important that this information or that my ability to gain this information is void of any confusion. Now you can imagine if I'm inattentive, let's say for example, I doze off in class and my teacher is talking, and then all of a sudden what happens? My teacher says something, right? And then it's a question. I raise my hand to answer. I answer wrong. He says to me, well, your answer is wrong. I said, well, no, why is it wrong? He said, because you weren't attentive at that particular point in time when I mentioned this point. And so what ended up happening is you ended up having a confusion, right, about a particular point because of your inattentiveness. So one reason for confusion is inattentiveness. Another reason for confusion is actually not inattentiveness itself. It could be you are attentive, but you just didn't understand the point. Or you might have heard the point, right? But you might not have understood a specific particular point within the point, so to speak, or something that's outside of it that makes it true. Let me give you an example. You remember when we were in middle school or in high school, for example, when we were doing math problems, right? And let's say, for example, that math problem required several steps for us to get to our answer. Now, what happens is that we have some teachers who, if we miss one step, we can get every single other part of the solution wrong, right? And some teachers will give you partial marks. Some teachers will just grade you with a 0 completely, right? So he says, al-intibah, salamat al-dhihn, salamat al-hawas, فقدان الشبهة, وأن تكون عملية غير عقلية, which means that a person has to be attentive, a person has to have good senses, a person has to have a mind that is healthy, right? Not a person who is drowsy or a person who is sick, and not a person who is insane, for example, or has intermittent episodes of insanity, right? And it has to be something that doesn't have any confusion in it, for it to be obvious knowledge, and it has to be also something that doesn't require a lot of thinking and research. Okay, so now that I understand this, at any one of these criteria, if any one of these criteria is missing, what ends up happening is we fall into error. And when we fall into error, we fall into batil, meaning that we fall into lack of truth. Now we know that we need the truth in our lives. The truth has to be the basis of everything that we do. And if I don't follow the truth, that what ends up happening is I end up falling into such confusions, right? And I end up going astray. Exactly like when I solve a mathematical solution thinking that I am 100% correct. And what ends up happening? What ends up happening is that I end up being 100% wrong. I thought I followed the right methods, but I actually didn't, because of a point of confusion or an inattentiveness, or the fact that I may have been sick, or I didn't get enough sleep, right? Or that I needed to research this information more in order for me to know how to solve the problem properly. So then the question is, how is it that past information that we had was considered to be bad at one point now becomes good? Well, in order to understand how this happens, we have to understand that there are, let's say, a minimum of 2 types of information, okay? Information that has to do with our morality, and information that, let's say, has to do with science, okay? So we know, let's take the science first. We know, for example, that in the past, our technology was limited. Our tools of measure were limited. So, for example, a telescope could only see, so far. But then the Hubble telescope was created, and we could see much more. And then when the Hubble telescope was retired, there was another telescope that today allows us to see even further into the cosmos, right? The reason why we might have been wrong before is because we might not have had the proper technology or advancements in science that would allow us to collect the proper information or the correct information. And what ends up happening is we end up falling into false claims, right? And this is very easy for us to do. Let me give you an example. For those of you who have listened to my lecture on evolution and on chaos theory, and if you haven't, I advise you to go to into the archive and listen to those. If you don't find them, you can find them on Knowledge Seekers 14 on YouTube. And in evolution, what we find, for example, is that a scientist found a jawbone, right? Humanity is looking for, or evolutionary biologists, I should say, were looking for the missing link, okay? What links the apes to the humans? There's a missing link. So that missing link, they thought they found. This one evolutionary biologist found a jaw or part of a jaw, okay? And he assumed that this part of a jaw had to be that missing link. So he literally constructed this whole persona, and he named her Lucy. Later on, as time went by and as more bones were collected and found, he discovered that his claim was false. The reason why is because he didn't have all of the information. It turned out to be a smaller ape. It's not that mistakes can't happen. Mistakes can happen. And what can be truth today may be false later on. In the realm of science, this is extremely common because of the fact that we might not have all of the tools and all of the information to make the correct conclusions. Therefore, it would become unscientific for someone to say that the theory of evolution, specifically that man came from apes, is 100% true, as we see in the media today, unless the reason to push this false information is some ulterior motive. And that ulterior motive is, let's say, for example, secularization, right? To ensure that people don't adhere to the truth, don't go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and think that this world has no purpose, that it came to be, because everybody needs to know their origin, right? I mean, that's why, for example, adoptees, they always want to know who their biological parents are. And if they don't, they feel lost. We see this all the time on TV, right? So that means that humanity needs to know what its origin is. But we have people who are scientists or claim to be scientists, but they are unscientific in their methodology. Even in their empiricism, as they collect the information and try to draw conclusions, they end up shooting much farther than they actually should have, because of the fact that they wanted to gain notoriety, or someone was paying them money, or they were afraid they would lose their grant dollars, or someone in the background wants to push this information to have people live in darkness and ignorance. And this brings us to an important point, and that is ignorance. Now, we know that ignorance is bad. Exactly like, for example, if I'm in a dark room, right? If I imagine that ignorance is darkness, I don't see anything, I don't know where anything is, it's very easy for me to slip and fall and get hurt as I walk through the room because of the fact that I can't see anything. But when I turn on the light, I turn on the light of knowledge, right? The ability to see gives me an understanding of the reality around me, right? And I can navigate my way through the room without bumping into any couches, right? And without falling over. So information then that is based on ignorance is considered to be speculation and conjecture, and it's ugly for me to follow that information, logically speaking, right? However, information that is based on turning on the light of knowledge is information that I do want, information that I do want to follow, and is an ideal situation that I want to be in. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be dark pockets, right? But once I get to the dark pocket, I have to turn on a flashlight, right? Or put a spotlight on it in order to be able to navigate. The problem is, in science, these spotlights and these lights being turned on require the proper tools to do so, right? And a lot of trial and error. We notice, for example, that in Mendelian genetics, Mendel, for example, with the experiment of the peas, genetically speaking, it came out later on, after many years, that his quadrants of genetic diversity or homogeneity versus heterogeneity actually ended up being false. He fudged his results. So his motivation wasn't that he didn't have the right tools. His motivation was that he didn't want to lose his grant dollars, right, and his reputation. So then we see then that this brings us then from science, right, and how things can and why things might not be known, right, to the ulterior motives that may sway the truth, okay? And this is the most important part really of the lecture. And that's that, if the truth is always true and falsehood is always false, how is it, logically speaking, that all of a sudden what was false at one point now becomes true? And we're not talking about science here, right? Because we answered that question already, because we said it depends on the technology that's available and the advances that are available to us, right? How is it that, for example, and I'm going to address moral issues, okay? How is it, for example, that something that was morally wrong at one point in time now becomes morally right? Let me give you an example. So before, let's say in the 40s, let's go back to the 30s, 20s and 30s, right? For example, in America, if you look at footage today on YouTube and you look at really old footage from the 40s, for example, or even from the late 1800s, you'll see how people are dressed, right? you'll see that everybody is conservatively dressed. You'll see women are fully covered, right? They don't show any skin whatsoever, except for their hands and their faces, and maybe a little bit of their neck. This is in America, okay? However, and of course, adultery was considered not only a sin, but it was punishable by law, okay? However, what we find is that today, you know, and slowly over time, right, this conservatism has decreased to the point that now, you know, you see on social media, for example, of course, none of you see this, but I'm sure you've heard, right, of this. I mean, I know that we're bombarded by images and ads and so forth, you know, of scantily clad women, right? And that this is just fashion, and this is trending. And now this dress code of wearing literally your underwear outside or lack thereof, you know, meaning wearing a bikini or wearing, you know, those sorts of scant clothing outside in public is something that today is considered extremely normal. While before, you can literally see videos of women entering the ocean wearing their clothes fully clothed, right? At one point, that was the norm. And today, the norm is completely opposite of what was the norm before. Before, the truth was that that was shameless to do. Today, the new truth is that, oh, it's basically, you know, shameful if you don't do that, right? Today, our sisters that wear hijab are literally being shamed for choosing to be modest, right? Why is that? How does that transition occur? One day it was bad to be, and it was considered a deviation, right? Even a psychological disorder for one to be attracted to the same gender, right? Today, everything has been turned upside down. Today, if you speak against that, even the church today, you find these TV pop preachers, when asked about the issue of LBGT, they will literally try to break and avoid and dodge like they're being hit by a dodgeball, right? Afraid to say anything, in a state of taqiyya, literally, right? Afraid that they'll be ostracized for their opinion. People like Joel Osteen and others, if you go online, these famous TV preachers, even though their opinion is known, they're afraid to say their opinion because literally now they have become victimized for preaching the truth, for believing and thinking that something is wrong, right? And if it's wrong once, then it's always going to be wrong, morally speaking, right? That morality is not something that changes over the span of time. Morality is something that is something you can depend on, right? Because it depends on the truth. It depends on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of us. Once I understand that, it becomes very hard for me to veer off that reality. But how then did that reality change for us, right? We know, for example, that the LBGT worked for many years working on trying to change their image, and they were able to do it by going into the Library of Congress and changing their classification from a mental disorder, right, or a psychological disorder, to being a diverse population that is a minority. Once they made that shift, right, what ended up happening? Everything changed for them. Now they became more socially acceptable because they are a minority. So that means then that morality can change, right? No, morality can't change. Why? Because I have to go back to that reference point. And the reference point is the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things. He is the unlimited. He is the all perfect. He created us as male and female so that we can procreate, we can have societies that are good and righteous and just, right? And that are not deviant, correct? And anything else that defies that moral code that Allah has placed for us becomes a deviation, whether it was at the beginning of time or the end of time, right? And the fact that people like Joel Osteen and other preachers practice taqiyya, right, is proof of the fact that A, people shouldn't be talking about Muslims when they practice taqiyya, okay? B, that taqiyya now has become really part of wisdom, right? Because you don't want to be ostracized by society or by the social structure and be pushed out of communities and be prevented from people listening to your opinions, so that then you can spread the truth, or at the very least preserve the truth for yourself and for your own community, right? Now I want to make something clear. That logically speaking, the only way that a moral code can change over a span of time is with the introduction of what? Of lies, right? There have to be lies that are introduced, okay? Now these lies that are introduced have to be in a format that is either done strategically so that small shifts and changes are made, right? Within, for example, society. Let me give you an example. So before, if you looked at TV shows were very conservative, even downright racist, right? Now, morality dictates that racism and prejudice is bad, right? However, when it comes to the moral divine code of how we should live our lives, right? That is solid, that is constant. Just like Allah himself, it does not change. However, what we find is if we look at TV, those who are affected by these ideologies, they infuse small confusions and small lies over the span of time until they normalize what before was what was false, morally speaking. And what they use is this frequency of 3. So in modern academia, now we'll move on to academia so we understand how this occurs. So academically speaking, the way that we can create new neuronal pathways is to see or hear something at least 3 times, right? So the more that I see or hear something, the more desensitized I become to it. And once I become desensitized to it, even if it's falsehood, then I've normalized it. And once I normalize it, then I've accepted it, right? And that's literally the formula to change the truth, a correct moral code, to a false moral code. And let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, I'm a conservative person, okay? And I go into college or university. And I study, let's say, for example, physiotherapy, okay? What happens is that in physiotherapy, I remember I had a friend in college who studied physiotherapy. They have to literally apply what they learn on each other, right? Now, I remember one of my friends said to me, and it wasn't me, I wasn't in physiotherapy, but my friend was in physiotherapy. He was a male. He said to me, Aous, you know, we have to literally give each other massages, and you know, physiotherapy has more girls in it than it has guys. What am I supposed to do, right? In his case, what he ended up doing is, and what he ended up feeling was that he became desensitized, right? Exactly like a doctor who takes anatomy class or a pre-med student. After a while, you become desensitized to blood, you become desensitized to death, you become desensitized to these things. And lies are no different. And that's what we find today, according to studies that have been conducted based on what occurred recently with the elections with Cambridge Analytica. It was explained that the reason why people ended up changing their opinions is because of the infusions of small confusions and small lies. So people either became inattentive to the truth, or they based their information on small confusions, right? And that caused them to live in a realm of ignorance, even though they didn't know, and base their decisions based on their confusions. And that is exactly how a moral code can be changed, right? That doesn't make it right, but that's exactly how that was done. Now, this ignorance is of 2 types, right? So the confusion that occurs causes an ignorance. That ignorance is of 2 types. Either it's a simple ignorance that one can correct by just removing the confusion, and this requires the person themselves to be, let's say, able to humble themselves and admit that they're wrong and want to learn, okay? And then you have the person who has a compound ignorance. And that compound ignorance it means that the person believes that they're 100% true and that there's no way that they could ever be wrong, right? So in issues that come to, you know, human opinion, meaning that morality, if it was based on human opinion, then that means that it's always going to be changing. Why? Because people's opinions change. And we see that with all of the isms, right? With all of the different philosophies, whether it's empiricism or whether it's Marxism or whether it's communism, right? People's opinions differ, and based on the leadership that they follow. Like imagine the people who lived in Hitler's time, right? The people who followed Hitler. I mean, they all believe at one point as Christians that, you know, killing is bad, right? That the Bible preaches that prejudice is bad. And yet what did they do? They infused lies, lie after lie, you know, in the Aryan nation, and the fact that they need to be, you know, homogeneous. And they made up things, you know, like someone whose hair is this color, someone whose eyes aren't blue, someone who is Jewish, someone who doesn't believe in them, you know, needs to be annihilated, right? A complete deviation of morality occurred at that time. So according to psychology, if we look at psychology today, what does it tell us? It tells us that the reason why people lie, because at the end of the road, these are all lies, right? Now, whether a person is aware that they're lying or not is a different story, right? But let's look at someone who is aware. Let's look at those who are working hard to change and to use strategies to be able to change our minds. Why do they do this? Why do they lie, right? Well, because to them, perhaps lying doesn't matter. Now, according to psychology today, the number one reason why people lie is just because it doesn't matter to them. The truth doesn't matter, right? But in actual fact, it does actually matter to them. Even though they say that it doesn't matter, it does actually matter to them. Because it might be, let's say, for example, that that a person, it might be, afwan, it might be the fact that a person themselves thinks that it's not a big deal to lie. That could be one reason, right? Or it could be that telling the truth feels like giving up control. And in order to have control, you need people to adhere to what you say. And so what you do is you constantly lie to ensure that people stay on your side so that you can control the situation or control them. Number three, they say that the reason why is because they might not want to disappoint the person, right? So this is generally speaking, not specifically talking about the strategies, meaning that, let's say, for example, somebody approaches you, right? And they have a specific ideology and you look up to them, all right? You might lie just to appease them, okay? Also, what psychology today says is that lies snowball. What ends up happening is a small lie turns into, you know, from a molehill to a mountain, right? And that's the very nature of lying. A liar tends to compound their lies. The more they lie, the harder it is for them to be able to go back, right? To go back to the truth. And when the damage is done, it's very hard to fix it, even if they do go back to the truth. Number five, it could be that it's not even a lie to them, just like that compound ignorance that we talked about, right? So one could be because they don't want to disappoint someone, but someone who strategically has a goal, right? Who wants to change morality, that person, to them, it might not be a lie, because to them, they've created a new reality and a new truth for themselves. They want consumerism. They want people to eat and drink their product, you know. So people or organizations like Monsanto and the people that work there, what do? They justify everything so that they're desensitized to a new reality. They become the lie. They believe their own lie, right? Exactly like, if you recall, if we look at the cigarette industry. Before, people that worked within the cigarette industry, within a company, right, they would literally base smoking being good based on how people perceive you, right? Number two, as the information was uncovered that smoking causes cancer, what ended up happening is they ended up working on the fact that at the end of the road, it's a personal choice. So now they moved it into choice, right? Before it was that it was good for you. Then it moved to that it's an image thing. Finally, it became that it's your right to choose to smoke, okay? So you notice, because of the fact that they want to sell their product, that became the motivation for them to justify their lies. And what they did literally is they have lobbyists in Congress to ensure that smoking and cigarettes stay for many years to come. The same idea is for the case of gas, for gasoline, right? The big oil companies don't want us to stop using cars that depend on gas. They don't want us to use electrical cars. And the reason why is because it's not good for their bottom line. Now, it could also be that this person has a confusion, right? It might not be just, compound ignorance. It might be truly that compound ignorance, which is normally the case, that compound ignorance is based on a confusion or inattentiveness, or I don't want to say a lack of their senses not being working, but because most people, their senses are working just fine, their brain function is working just fine. But it could be that they're inattentive to something, or that no, they have a confusion, right? Or that for them, the bottom line is, their pocket, the dollar, the power, right? And we see this today on TV. We see how, a pathological liar is trying to convince everybody that, he can do no wrong, right? And every time he says something, he backtracks and he says, oh, no, you know what? That's not what I meant, right? This is what I really meant. And it becomes a case of literally trying to control your image amongst people, and literally trying to control everything around you, and moving things towards not what benefits society, but rather what benefits your bottom line, or the bottom line of those who are supporting you. So what does Islam tell us? Islam tells us that there's a clear difference between truth and falsehood. Right? Remember the verse that we started with, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us. He says in verse 42 of chapter 2 of Al-Baqarah, he says, وَلَا تَلْبِسُوا الْحَقَّ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَتَكْتُمُوا الْحَقَّ وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah warns us, he says, and he uses la here. This la is a jussive, which means that it's adat jazm, which means for sure. For sure, do not do this. Okay? وَلَا تَلْبِسُوا, and do not confuse, Allah says, al-haqq bil-batil, truth with falsehood. And then he warns us of something else. He says, وَتَكْتُمُوا الْحَقَّ وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, and you keep the truth from others when you know full well what the truth is. Imam al-Baqir salamullahi alayhi is mentioned in a hadith in al-Bihar in chapter 75, page 196, hadith number 9. Imam al-Baqir salamullahi alayhi is narrated to have said that Amir al-Mu'mineen salamullahi alayhi was asked, كَمْ بَيْنَ الْحَقِّ وَالْبَاطِلِ, what's the difference between truth and falsehood? He said, أَرْبَعَ أَصَابِعَ. Right? He says, أَرْبَعَ أَصَابِعَ. And then the narration says that وَوَضَعَ أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَدَهُ عَلَى أُذُنِهِ وَعَيْنَيْهِ. He said he put his hand like this, with his four fingers, from his ear all the way to his eyes, like this. And he said, فَقَالْ مَا رَأَتْهُ عَيْنَاكَ فَهُوَ حَقٌّ. He says, what your eyes see, that's the truth. Okay? وَمَا سَمِعَتْهُ أُذُنَاكَ فَأَكْثَرُهُ بَاطِلٌ. He says, and as for what your ears have heard, most of it is false. So now I have a standard. Islamically, again, holistic religion, right? Beautiful system, epistemological system that helps us understand the difference between truth and falsehood. What does Islam tell us? Islam tells us, look, what you see with your own two eyes, you know that that's for certain, that's yaqeen. But what you hear with your ears, most of it, right? Not a little of it, not just some of it, most of it is false, which means that you can't trust everything that you can hear or that you hear. How many times, for example, I might have heard, let's say I have a tree outside of my house, and or actually this happened to me. My house bell would keep going off, right? And I'd come up, and I'd come to the front door, open up the door, there's nobody there. And what I found out that it was actually the wind that was causing the bell to glitch. So hearing then is different than seeing, right? Now, what are the reasons for falling into batil? Al-Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salamullahi alayhi, he tells us beautifully in one hadith, he says, إِنَّ الْأَمَلَ يُسْهِي الْقَلْبِ. He says, false hope, right, causes your heart to be inattentive. Notice one of the reasons for getting something wrong, right? For misunderstanding, for information not being obvious to us, that the heart may be inattentive. And what causes the heart to be inattentive? False hope, right? Amir al-Mu'mineen, salamullah alayhi, is narrated to say that he fears for us from two things. طول الأمل واتباع الهوى, right? He says, أخاف عليكم من أمرين. اتباع الهوى وطول الأمل. أما اتباع الهوى فيصد عن الحق. وأما طول الأمل فينسي الآخرة, right? So what does he say? He says, I fear for you from two things. Following your whims and having false hope. Procrastinating from doing the things that you need to do now. You know how we're feeling today during the Corona times, that there's so much that we could have done that we didn't do, right? And the reason why we didn't do it, the reason why we didn't recite Quran, the reason why we weren't kind to our parents, the reason why we didn't apologize to the people who we wronged, is because we kept on saying, oh, we'll get to it, we'll get to it. That's false hope. And what that makes you do is it makes your heart inattentive, right? And so the result of that is that you end up forgetting the hereafter. You end up forgetting your final goal, which is that this world is temporary and that your reward is in the hereafter, but your punishment is also in the hereafter. So false hope places almost like a covering over our hearts, causing us to become inattentive. As for ittiba' al-hawa, which means following your whim, that's another reason that we would fall into batil, fall into falsehood. And that's that we're following our own whims and desires. We're not looking at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of us. And that is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the chapter of An-Najm, verses 3 and 4 about Prophet Muhammad, he said, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. And he does not speak out of his own whim. إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. Surely what he says, what he does is nothing but revelation. Which means that he dedicated all of his faculties, our holy prophet, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what Allah commands him to do and what Allah wants him to do. And therefore that must be our goal too, not to follow our whims and to fall into them. Now what's the difference between whim and for example, our desire, right? We know that there are some things, well, first of all, whim itself is to say, just do it. I did it on a whim, right? I didn't think about it, I just did it. While I might desire something, desire can be more specific as a term, meaning that I can desire something good or I can desire something bad. But a whim can never be good, right? A whim can never be good because you've never really thought about, why you did what you did. You just did it. And that's what makes it so dangerous. However, desire, Allah placed within us. It can be used towards good or it can be used towards bad. I can desire to help someone, right? I can desire to get married, and that's good, and Allah encourages it, right? But desiring to do haram, that's bad, correct? So you see then, whim is very dangerous. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not do anything out of his whim, which means that we have to stay away from it, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says to Prophet Dawood, he says, وَلَا تَتَّبِعِ الْهَوَى فَيُضِلُّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Do not follow your whim, for it causes you to deviate away from the path of Allah, from the Sirat Mustaqim. Which means that the reason also for people lying and people creating or following falsehood is exactly that, is whim. Whim is extremely dangerous because of the fact that you either just do it or you do it because you believe that either through simple or compound ignorance that what you're doing is right? And you change your entire moral code as a result, right? You put yourself, let's say for example, you put yourself in a situation that causes you time and time again to be exposed to haram. You say to me, oh, but Sheikhna, I have to make a living. I have to, work at this place where we sell haram things. I say to you, no, you don't have to. You can go work in a gas station. Or if you say, no, sometimes I have to sell la samahallah beer or bacon or stuff like that, we say to you, first of all, you need to know your deen. Qa'idat al-ilzam tells you, look at how beautiful Islam is. Qa'idat al-ilzam tells you, alzimuhum bima alzamu anfusahum, right? They themselves, you have to, if they're Christian, you have to hold them to what they believe in, right? So if they eat haram food, you can sell haram food to them, but they can't be Muslim, okay? However, alcohol is a problem. You can't sell the alcohol, right? So unless you know qa'idat al-ikhtisas, which means that you're really not selling the alcohol, you're just removing your hand from it, right? But at the end of the road, the reality is this. At the end of the road, we have to know the right information to be able to know how to navigate through life, right? If I work in, let's say, an environment such as a restaurant where, you know, I'm around haram food all the time, or I'm around haram products all the time, then what's going to happen? I'll be desensitized to haram. It's just a psychological, neurological response, right, to being around something for a frequency that is greater than 3. Because once you make the choice to accept being in such an environment, then literally you've programmed yourself to have a habit, right? And that habit is going to continue, all right, unless you make a change to it. So let's continue with this narration. So the Imam says, إِنَّ الْأَمَلَ يُسْهِي الْقَلْبِ. So having false hope causes your heart to become inattentive to the truth, to the intellect, right? And therefore, if it's inattentive, it's more likely to fall into bad decisions. Because remember, we said al-qalb is where the decisions are made. They're either influenced by nafs, al-ammara bis-su', that causes the nafs that causes one to make a bad decision, or al-aql, that brings someone closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the knowledge of Ahlul Bayt. Then he says, وَيَكْذِبُ الْوَعْدِ. He says, إِنَّ الْأَمَلَ يُسْهِي الْقَلْبِ. So this false hope is very dangerous. One, it causes your heart to become inattentive and fall into making the wrong decisions. 2, يُكَذِّبُ الْوَعْدِ. It causes you to, delay your covenants, right? Say that you didn't promise what you promised because you delayed things, you became embarrassed. Next thing you know, right? You've created a new reality for yourself, right? وَيُكْثِرُ الْغَفْلَةِ. So it causes one to fall into inattentiveness or heedlessness greatly. So false hope is dangerous. We have to be mindful of false hope and procrastination because it causes us literally to fall into batil. وَيُورِثُ الْحَسْرَةِ, which means that at the end of the road, you're going to end up being regretful, right? So false hope is dangerous. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, He says, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. He says, and we have placed in hellfire many jinn and men who have hearts with which they do not understand. So the heart is essential here. So false hope, if it creates this blurriness over the heart and inattentiveness, then look at what happens. I end up making the wrong decisions. Next thing you know, I'm off of Sarat al-Mustaqim, I've deviated, and I've ended up in hellfire. Why? Because now my heart doesn't understand what it needs to do. It's in a state of confusion because of that inattentiveness or because of that state of desensitization or as a result of my false hope that has caused me to fall into this. Oh, I'll get a halal job later on. I have time, right? No, you don't have time. This is false hope. You don't own time. You don't know whether you have tomorrow or not, right? Allah only knows. So to make such an assumption is extremely presumptuous, right? It almost is giving yourself power that is not yours. How many of us think about time that way? We don't, and we need to, right? And then he says, وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا. And they have eyes with which they do not see. And Imam Ali said very, very clearly that the truth is what you can see, right? Now we'll talk about how what you can see also refers to your insight as well. وَأَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا. Not even their ears. At least some truth to hear from your ears. أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. Allah says, those are like cattle prod. No, He says, nay, no, they are even worse, right? Because at least the cattle, Allah programmed them instinctually to do certain things. But this person knows that they have a choice between falsehood and truth, and yet they choose to follow falsehood. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. Says, those are the heedless. So then false hope causes heedlessness, right? And I have to be mindful not to have false hope so that I don't fall into heedlessness, right? Because it causes me to forget the hereafter and causes me to also maybe even follow my whim, and that's going to prevent me from entering heaven, right? Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but since we were talking about those who strategize to deviate people, let's look at the chapter of Al Imran, chapter 3, verse 7. Allah speaks about the Holy Quran. He tells us, what is contained within it, and He tells us who it is that actually holds the truth, meaning who is qualified to explain it and who is unqualified, and what is their motivation for trying to take on that role, a role that isn't theirs, so that they deviate people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this holy verse, in chapter 3, verse 7, He says, هُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ مِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ. He is the one that revealed unto you the holy book. Of this book are ayat muhkamat, meaning verses that are known and understood. These are ayat of ahkam, of Islamic law. Hunna ummul kitab. They are the mother of the book. They're the basis of the book itself. Wa ukhra mutashabihat. And then there are other verses that are unclear. Okay? فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ. As for those who have deviation in their heart, فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ. They are the ones who follow the unclear verses. They leave the clear verses to revel in the unclear verses. Why? Because most likely they want to use them to their advantage. Let's see what Allah says. He says, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ. Why? He says, ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. Because they want to create unrest in society, right? That's number one. And two, because they want to say that they know the ta'wil. And for those who don't know, there's tafsir and ta'wil. Tafsir specifically is just the explanation of verses. And this can apply to verses that are muhkamat as well as verses that are mutashabihat. But ta'wil specifically applies to verses that are mutashabihat, the unclear verses. And then Allah clarifies. He says, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. He says, and no one knows the explanation of the unclear verses except for Allah and those who are entrenched in knowledge, right? Meaning those who Allah has given them that knowledge. Who are they? Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, salamullahi alayhi, he says, when he was asked, who are al-rasikhuna fil ilm? He said, نحن الراسخون في العلم ونحن نعلم تأويله. We are those who are entrenched in knowledge, and we are the ones that know the meanings of these unclear verses. Those are the ones Allah says, يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. We believe in all of it. Everything, all of these verses are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا يَذْكُرُ إِلَّا أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. And only those of sound minds, right? Only those who want the truth are the ones who will realize this reality. Now, we mentioned before then that using your eyesight will allow us to see the truth. However, what if, and we know that psychologically speaking, that our preconceived notions, right, even our false motivations can cause us that when we see something with our own two eyes, we can justify it, right, towards our own means, right, and our own ends. And let me give you an example. Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he explains this beautifully. He says, نظر البصر لا يجدي إذا عميت البصيرة. He says, look, looking with your eyes might not be enough if your insight is blinded. Right? So if you're in a state of ghafla because of طول الأمل, false hope, then what's going to happen? You're going to be inattentive and be heedless. And as a result, even what you see with your own two eyes, you might see with a false lens. Al-Imam also says, فَاقِدُ الْبَصَرِ فَاسِدُ النَّظَرِ, meaning that a person who can't see properly, right, he's going to have false and corrupted insights. So notice the danger of that internal false motivation within us, right, that can occur. And that can even cause what we see to be false. Oh, I didn't see it that way. How many times have you heard someone say that? Oh, you know, the two of us were there. We both saw him do this, right? What he did was wrong. It's like, well, you know, I didn't see anything wrong with what he was doing. Why? Because that person's belief system is different, right? So for example, a Muslim, let's say a Muslim who is adherent and a Muslim who is not adherent, right? They both go to the shore, okay? The Muslim who is an adherent Muslim, he sees that there are people who are scantily dressed. And what does he say? He says, no, astaghfirullah, I'm not going to go there. Let's go to the park. Let's go somewhere else. But the unadherent Muslim, who's a little far, his insight is far gone, right? He says, I don't see anything wrong. What's wrong with that, right? People can dress as they wish, correct? And how many times do we hear this? But that's false. Why? Because that person's heart has been corrupted because of their false hope, because of their hawa, because they want to follow their whims. They have been deviated from the path, and so they can't see the truth properly. The Imam Salamullahi alayhi, because now we're going to ask, well, how can I get my insight to be right? Right? And what is this insight? Imam Ali Salamullahi alayhi explains it beautifully. He defines insight. He says, فَإِنَّمَا الْبَصِيرُ مَنْ سَمِعَ فَتَفَكَّرَ. He says a person who has insight is a person who hears information and contemplates over it. وَنَظَرَ فَأَبْصَرَ. And when he thinks, when he contemplates, what happens? He sees the reality of things. Not necessarily visually. He sees the reality of things because everything is based on what he knows, that Allah is the truth. And he uses that as a reference point. وَانْتَفَعَ بِالْعِبَرِ. And when he sees things that are bad happening, he learns from them, right? When he recognizes then the moral of every story that he sees before him. ثُمَّ سَلَكَ جُدَدًا وَاضِحًا. And then what happens as a result? He takes a path that is sometimes and most of the time least traveled, unfortunately. And that's the path of truth. واضحا يتجنب فيه الصرعة في المهاوي. Right? Notice how here he connects the basira to staying on the straight path and avoiding. He says, when you do this, when you with your insight you see things, you're going to contemplate about them, you're going to see the reality of them as a result, right? You'll have fully operational strong insight. You're going to benefit then from the morals of every story you see before you, and you're going to be able to put your feet on the straight path because that path will now be clear for you, and you'll be able to avoid falling into your whim. And he calls it يَتَجَنَّبُ فِيهِ صَرْعَةً مِنْ فِي الْهَوَى, which means that he prevents himself from falling into a deep dark abyss of death, right? As a result of following his whim. So he avoids whim. Now, the other thing that the Imam Salamullahi alayhi tells us is that disbelief is built on 4 pillars. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, as is mentioned in the book of Al-Kafi, the second juz of Safha 391 to 393, he says, بُنِيَ الْكُفْرُ عَلَى أَرْبَعِ دَعَامٍ. He says, look, disbelief, because we figured out so far that disbelief, not having that reference point, is really the problem. Okay. Now you might say, but there are many people who aren't Muslim, right, who do follow the truth. Yes, but they're more likely to veer off the path, just as we see with the acceptance of certain types of gender deviations, right? Just as we see with the accepting, the change in morality of society from being conservative and modest to being inconservative and immodest, right? So he says disbelief is based on 4 pillars. He says al-fisq, corruption, al-ghulu, which means that making up certain realities and believing in them, was-shak, and doubt, was-shubha, and confusion. I want to focus on a shak was-shubha specifically. Okay, so the Imam Salamullah alayhi, he explains. He says, was-shakku ala arba'i shu'ab. He says doubt has 4 branches, or is of 4 types. He says على المرية والهوى والتردد والاستسلام. He says, look, shak is a result of duplicity, of following your whim, of hesitation, being hesitant to follow the truth, والاستسلام, and submitting to falsehood. He says, فَمَنْ هَالَهُ مَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ نَكَصَ عَلَىٰ عَقِبَيْهِ. He says, so a person who decides not to follow the truth will literally fall on his face. وَمَنْ امْتَرَى فِي الدِّينِ تَرَدَّدْ. And the person who is duplicitous in their religion, what happens? They end up being hesitant, right? As a result of doubt. وَسَبَقَهُ الْأَوَّلُونَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And then those who were believers before, they didn't fall into this, right? Or some of them might have fallen into this. He then says, وَأَدْرَكَهُ الْآخَرُونَ. this is the important part here. He says, وَوَطَأَتْهُ سَنَابِكُ الشَّيْطَانِ. He says, and he literally has been penetrated by the claws of shaitan. And then he says, so here he's at what? He's at taraddud, that this hesitation, okay, this hesitation has caused him to fall into this state. Shaitan has taken over him until he reaches a state of submitting to falsehood. He says, وَمَنْ اسْتَسْلَمَ لِهَلَكَةِ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ هَلَكَ فِيمَا بَيْنَهُمَا. And a person, therefore, who submits to dunya, to worldly wants and needs, and ends up losing out in this world and in the hereafter. And then he tells us, he gives us a solution. He says, وَمَنْ نَجَى مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَمِنْ فَضْلِ الْيَقِينِ. He says, and those who are able to avoid all this, right, and be saved, are saved by one thing, and that is certainty, yaqeen. In what? In Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَمْ يَخْلُقْ اللَّهُ خَلْقًا أَقَلْ مِنَ الْيَقِينِ. And Allah did not create a creation that is better than yaqeen, than certainty. Now, what about confusion? Because I want to understand confusion and how it happens. He says, الشُّبْهَةُ عَلَى أَرْبَعِ شُعَبٍ. He says, again, confusion, just like doubt, is based on 4 branches. He says, إِعْجَابٌ بِالزِّينَةِ, admiring adornment. وَتَسْوِيلُ النَّفْسِ, and your nafs basically making things that are wrong seem as though they're right and good for you to do, right? وَتَأَوُّلُ الْعِوَجِ, and trying to give excuses and to make a deviation seem okay, right? As though you're, and that usually happens as a result of desensitization. وَلَبْسُ الْحَقِّ بِالْبَاطِلِ, and confusing truth with falsehood. Then he says, how? He says, وَذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ الزِّينَةَ تَصَدَّفَتْ عَنِ الْبَيِّنَةِ. He says that is because the adornment has blinded you from seeing the truth and the reality. وَأَنَّ تَسْوِيلَ النَّفْسِ تُقْحِمُ عَلَى الشَّهْوَةِ أو تَقَحَّمَ عَلى الشَّهْوَةِ. Meaning that when the nafs that commands us to do ill is in control and causes us to accept those things that are morally wrong, it ends up bombarding us, right, with shahwa, with our desires, our false desires, the bad desires, the whims. وَأَنَّ الْعِوَجَ يَمِيلُ بِصَاحِبِهِ مَيْلًا عَظِيمًا. And that deviation veers us, causes us to veer off the path greatly, so that, you know, imagine, how does one deviate from a path, right? Either abruptly or slowly. But with the nafs, taswil al-nafs, causing me to slowly veer off, right, to be desensitized, next thing you know, I'm completely off the road. How many times has that happened to us, right? And then he says, وَأَنَّ اللَّبْسَ ظُلُمَاتٌ بَعْضُهَا فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ. That the confusion that results as a result of the deviation, this confusion between truth and falsehood, is darkness over darkness, right? فَذَلِكَ الْكُفْرُ وَدَعَائِمُهُ وَشُعَبُهُ. That is then disbelief, and those are its 4 pillars, and these are the branches of each of those pillars. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we might ask, well, what is the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, you know, placed this falsehood in our way? Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He created us in this world لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, so that He can test us to see which of us are better and most righteous in deeds. And the more we, in these tests, are able to surpass and move beyond the falsehood and keep ourselves on the straight path, the more our reward, right? The more we've shown our gratification, our appreciation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more He's going to appreciate us and reward us in the hereafter. Allah says in the chapter of Al-Ra'd, verse 20, He says, كَذَلِكَ يَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْحَقَّ وَالْبَاطِلَ فَأَمَّا الزَّبُدَ فَيَذْهَبُ جَفَاءً وَأَمَّا مَا يَنْفَعُ النَّاسِ فَيَمْكُثُ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَذَلِكَ يَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالَ. He says, look, this truth and this falsehood, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places on this earth, right, to test us with. At the end of the road, what happens is that the truth will reign. It will stay on this earth, right? And the falsehood will just go away. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says also that at the end of the road, truth will reign. He says it clearly in the chapter of Al-Isra, verse 81. He says, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. He says, look, the truth has come, the falsehood has fallen. Surely falsehood will always lose out, right? Now, how do I know what is true from what is false? We said we go back to the reference point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran in the chapter of Yunus, verse 35, أَفَمَنْ يَهْدِي إِلَى الْحَقِّ أَحَقَّ أَنْ يُتَّبَعْ أَمَّنْ يَهْدِي إِلَّا أَنْ يَهِدِّي فَمَا لَكُمْ كَيْفَ تَحْكُمُونَ. Allah says, is the person who guides you to the truth equal to the person who himself needs guidance? He says, how is it that you pass judgment and you make decisions, right? It's as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, how dare you follow someone? You know, how can you think falsely this way and think that you can follow someone who himself bowed down to idols, who ascribed partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you leave Prophet Muhammad and Ali ibn Abi Talib salamullahi alayhi? In Amali Sheikh al-Tusi, in page 134 and pages 216, Allah, the Imam salamullahi alayhi says, إِنَّ الْحَقَّ وَالْبَاطِلَ لَا يُعْرَفَانِ بِالنَّاسِ. Truth and falsehood is not known by the people themselves. وَلَكِنْ اعْرِفِ الْحَقِّ بِاتِّبَاعِ مَنِ اتَّبَعَ. Know the truth by following those who follow the truth. Meaning, know the truth, that way you'll know who is truly following the truth, right? That will be your measure. وَالْبَاطِلُ, so know the truth by following the people of the truth, those who follow it. And no falsehood, he says, وَالْبَاطِلُ بِاجْتِنَابِ مَنِ اجْتَنَبَ. Meaning that no falsehood by avoiding it, by seeing those people who follow the truth avoid it, right? So make sure that you're in a good team of people that follow the truth. And those are really those great scholars of ours that follow Ahl al-Bayt and give us their teachings. The Imam says, no people. He says, إِنَّ الْخَيْرَ وَالشَّرَّ, because at the end of the road, if I'm not going to know the truth by the people, but I'll know the truth by those who follow the truth, right? So how does that work? He says, look, he says, إِنَّ الْخَيْرَ وَالشَّرَّ لَا يُعْرَفَانِ إِلَّا بِالنَّاسِ. He says, look, good and evil are only known by people, by their actions. فَإِذَا أَرَدْتَ أَن تَعْرِفَ الْخَيْرَ فَاعْمَلِ الْخَيْرَ تَعْرِفْ أَهْلَهِ. If you want to know righteousness, then do good, and then you'll be surrounded by those who appreciate the good, and you'll know who they are that way. وَإِذَا أَرَدْتَ أَن تَعْرِفَ الشَّرَّ. And if you wanted to know evil, then do evil, and look at how evil comes your way, and evil people surround you. So how do I decipher, and how do I know when to decipher between truth and falsehood, since we're talking about people? Allah mentions in the chapter of Al-Hujurat, verse 6, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, O you who believe, إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. If a corrupt person comes to you with news, then make sure that you investigate, right? That you verify that information. أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. Otherwise, you might cause people to fall into ignorance, the darkness of ignorance, and then you'll be full of regret for the damage that you have caused. Now, how is it then that I can know the truth? So I know the truth by looking at the people who follow the truth, right? Those who do righteousness, I know that they are the people of righteousness, and I know righteousness. But Imam Ali salamullah alayhi, he says, look, he says that belief itself, this is why belief is important in Allah. Again, back to that reference point that we proved logically, that he says, al-imanu aslul haq. He says, look, iman itself is the very root, the very principle of truth. Because if you recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost, and you prove His existence, then you know that everything succumbs to Him, that everything is under His command. And therefore, He's the one that places the laws, He's the one that places the rules. And those who want to know how to prove that, right? You can easily look into the archive or go to Knowledge Seekers 14 on YouTube, and those are posted this month of Ramadan, those short clips that teach you how to become a believer and discover the truth through the intellect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. So he says, Al-imanu aslul haqq. Belief is the very root and origin of truth. He says, Wal-haqqu sabilul huda. He says, and truth is the pathway to guidance. He says, وَسَيْفُهُ جَامِعُ الْحِلْيَةِ. He says, and it is basically a sword, he says, that collects all of goodness, of all of the good characteristics. قَدِيمُ الْعِدَى الدُّنْيَا مِضْمَارُ. He says that it's always, truth is always truth, right? And this world is where this sword of truth works. So when I choose truth over falsehood, I've cut falsehood out of my way. It's such a beautiful metaphor. And I've left only the truth, right? So if we imagine ourselves as we walk through life, literally killing falsehood every time we go across, we come across it, right? That's exactly, now we're not saying, you know, go around and be violent. That's not what we're saying. We're saying like kill falsehood with your belief and with your knowledge and with your insight, right? And with by pushing yourself away from طول الأمل, false hope, and therefore heedlessness, and therefore whim as well. Salamullahi alayhi Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, Bil-imanu yustadallu ala salihat. With belief, you are able to deduce what is a good deed. وَبِالصَّالِحَاتِ يُسْتَدَلُّ عَلَى الْإِيمَانِ. And vice versa. Through seeing goodness and good righteous deeds, you are able to see what belief really is. وَالْإِيمَانُ يُعَمِّرُ الْعِلْمِ. And having belief builds one's knowledge. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says this beautifully. He said, عَلِيٌّ مَعَ الْحَقِّ وَالْحَقُّ مَعَ عَلِيٍّ وَلَنْ يَفْتَرِقَا حَتَّى يَرِدَا عَلَيَّ الْحَوْضَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. You want to know the truth? He says the truth is with Ali ibn Abi Talib, salamullahi alayhi. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Babul Ilm. Right? فَمَنْ أَرَادَ الْمَدِينَةَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ فَلْيَأْتِهَا مِنْ بَابِهَا. Prophet Muhammad says, he says, he who wants the truth, who wants the city of knowledge and wants the wisdom of the Prophet, then he must enter through its door. Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali is with the truth, salamullahi alayhi, and the truth is with Ali. They will never separate, the Prophet says, until the day of judgment when they come to me and meet me in Kawthar. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us of the followers of Ali ibn Abi Talib, salamullahi alayhi, and Ahlul Bayt and al-Ma'sumin of his progeny. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to see the truth as the truth and falsehood as falsehood, so that we know to avoid the falsehood and to stay on as-sirat al-mustaqim. May Allah keep you all on the sirat al-mustaqim. May Allah lighten the load and the burden upon all those who are burdened during this time of the pandemic. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to gain knowledge, to improve our belief system, to come closer to Him, for surely He is the truth. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His mercy on our dearly departed, gives health to our sick, that He hastens the appearance of Al-Imam Al-Hujjah so that truth will reign and falsehood will just dissolve away. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين والفاتحة على أرواح المرحومين مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. ونسألكم الدعاء. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.